Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Mathiesen. I'm the Patient Services Coordinator with the Massachusetts MECFS and FM Association, and your moderator for today's event. I would like to welcome you to our annual meeting and program today featuring a very special guest, clinician, researcher, educator, and author, Patricia Fennell. Patricia's presentation is entitled The Powerful Paradigm for Living with Chronic Illness. We are thrilled that so many of you could join us. We have almost 300 registrants for today's event. I'd like to give a special welcome to our members, volunteers, and guests from around the globe. Thank you for being here. The majority of attendees today are people with ME, long COVID, or other chronic conditions. We will begin our program today with a report to membership, which is an annual requirement of our charter. Then Patricia Fennell will present her talk, followed by a 5-minute break. After the break, we will come back for a Q&A session facilitated by MassME board member Phil Chernin. Patricia will gladly address your questions. Please note that today's event will be recorded and will be available for your viewing at a later date. Please feel free to leave the meeting whenever you need to go. We invite you to submit questions at the end of Patricia's presentation using the Q&A function of Zoom. Before doing so, please scroll through questions that have already been submitted. And if you see a question similar to yours, click on the thumbs up button to prioritize it. If your question is unique, please go ahead and ask it. For everyone, whether or not you have a question in mind, feel free to scroll through the questions and give thumbs up to the ones you'd like us to give priority to. We will cover as many questions as we have time for. An important reminder, Patricia cannot answer any questions that relate to your specific medical question, and this content is purely educational. At this time, and continuing through to the report to members, the chat function is enabled. After that, the chat will only be open during the break and again at the end of the event. When using the chat function, please exercise common sense and common courtesy. We reserve the right to remove individuals from the meeting for inappropriate chat behavior. Just a reminder, closed captioning is available in real time by enabling the function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Now we have a couple of poll questions that will help us learn a bit about you. Select your answer quickly and we'll show the results. Here's the next question. Oh, okay, yep. So it looks like overwhelmingly we've got a lot of people with MECFS, a few people with long COVID, a few people with both, and 5% are other, and 5% are none of the above. So a lot of variety. All right, let's try the next question. All right, what are the answers to that? So overwhelmingly, looks like half of us have been sick for more than 20 years. I'm in that group myself. Then 23% have been sick for 10 to 20 years. 8% have been sick for 5 to 10 years. And 15% have been sick for 2 to 5 years. And a few have been sick for less than 2 years. So in many cases, people are pretty experienced with these diseases. Thank you for participating. Okay, and now I would like to welcome Susan Buckley. Susan is a longtime volunteer who has served in the past as director, treasurer, and volunteer coordinator. She now serves as president of our association. Take it away, Susan.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you all for coming today. I know you're here for Patricia Fennell's presentation, so I'm going to keep the MassME annual report short and I hope sweet. In 2024, we continue to celebrate our organization's 40 years of history. At last year's annual event, I ran very quickly through that extraordinary history. If you're interested, you can find links in the chat for the recording for that presentation and for the more extended version we presented at one of our Sunday conversations. This year, I really want to focus on the work we're doing now on behalf of our community, as well as what we've been doing behind the scenes to bring our organization into the future as a leading voice for those with ME and for those with other infection-associated chronic conditions and illnesses, or IICCIs, like long COVID. Now, the very best thing that MassME could do, quite frankly, is put ourselves out of business. To create a world where ME research is fully funded, where every person with ME is seen, heard, and has access to effective treatments and informed care. And we have seen more movement toward that world in the last few years than we have in a long time. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine convened an extraordinary set of workshops examining long COVID. The NIH finally published the results of their intensive intramural ME study, and with the input of leading ME researchers and clinicians, published a clear and comprehensive research roadmap. Now we just need to get that research funded, which is, of course, not an easy task. MassME is working with other organizations and advocacy groups to keep pushing on that. And while we work to get to that world I mentioned before, MassME will continue to provide education, advocacy, and support to our community. So here's how we did that this year. Our patient services team provided one-on-one assistance to over 180 people, providing physician referrals, disability counseling, peer support, help accessing services, and sometimes just providing an ear to listen and a shoulder to lean on. That team, led by Amanda Mathiesen, who you just saw, is informed and really empathetic. They are amazing. And during the break, you'll see some of the responses we received from those people that we were able to help. In addition to that direct individual support, our support groups helped over 200 people find a place to exchange information with others facing the same kinds of challenges. And our support group program expanded with 2 new groups this year, a Facebook group open to our members, and a series of art therapy programs in collaboration with the Bateman Horn Center. The latter was run by the wonderful Carrie Lang, who also moderates our young adult support group. And I also want to give a big shout out to Lisa Espiritu, who runs our other patient support group. Our information outreach continues to expand. Our monthly newsletter reaches people in 13 countries. We're active on social media channels, and our audience here continues to grow. And the videos on our YouTube channel have had almost 120,000 views. So if you add up the subscribers to all of those previous information channels, we reach over almost 11,000 people on a regular basis. All right, the Sunday Conversations program. I cannot say enough about this program and the team that puts these together. Over the last 2 years, this team has mounted a program almost every month that makes critical information easily available to those who need it. If you missed the series they presented this year on common comorbidities of ME, I highly recommend that you find those on our YouTube channel. Next year, Sunday Conversations will continue, but with a different cadence. You can expect to see programming every second month rather than every month, and we'll be alternating invited guest speakers with programs where we bring you, our community, together to speak to each other in small groups about specific topics. We've done that a few times in the past, and it's always been really well received. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all the members of the Sunday Conversations team, but particularly today, Charmian Proskauer. Charmian has led this program for 2 years with her signature grace and diligence. She's stepping back at this point, and I just want to express our gratitude for everything she's done for this program and for our organization as a whole. All right. Advocacy, as you know, is one of the main pillars of MassME. With the leadership of our new advocacy coordinator, the fearless Cheryl Breslin, and an intrepid group of volunteers, we're really focusing on working with the Massachusetts legislature and the Department of Public Health to establish or improve services that support people with ME, long COVID, and other IACCIs. And they're also mapping all of our Massachusetts community, by legislative district so that we can do really focused communications. And on Capitol Hill, we are so fortunate to have Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey as a longtime champion for those with ME/CFS. MassME members Rivik Solomon and Sonia Heller-Irie have been working with Markey's office on some IACCI initiatives. Hope to have some news on that soon. And the MassME community showed up in force during this year's lobby week, meeting virtually with legislative aides in both senators' offices and 8 out of 9 Massachusetts House offices. So if anyone on this in this event here today is in the 6th district with Representative Seth Moulton, we'd love to hear from you. So, and if you could participate next year, we can make that the complete set. And I want to say very few states have this kind of representation at Lobby Week. So a big thank you to everyone who found the spoons to take part in that. All right, we are also pursuing healthcare education. Board member Hala Sluss, a researcher at the UMass Chan Medical School, presented a medical education symposium at that school. And Patricia Fennell, our guest today, also participated in this event. The recording of this will be available soon, I hope within a week. And one really fun thing we did this year was put together a team that participated in the McCourt Foundation's 5K run in Boston. And I know it's a little counterintuitive for MassME to participate in an athletic event, but our team was made up of healthy allies and caregivers, as well as some folks with ME who are able to participate with or without assistive devices. We call it a walk, run, roll. The weather, unfortunately, did not cooperate, and we all got soaked. But we had a blast. And in our first year of participation at this event, Team MassME was one of the highest fundraisers. So I'm really looking forward to doing this again next year and hopefully staying dry this time. If you'd like to join us or know someone who would like to join our team, you can just reach out at the contact us email address. Now, we've been really busy this year behind the scenes as well. We're porting our database and communications infrastructure to a new platform. You'll start to see some changes in our registration forms, emails, and newsletter in the next few weeks. Please excuse us for any slowdowns or stumbles as we make this transition. And I'm really pleased to report that we've been engaged in a major overhaul of our aging website. We aren't quite ready to launch. Believe me, we will make a lot of noise when we do. But I wanted to give you a sneak peek of what the new site is starting to look like. So what I'm showing you now is still under construction. It's been a massive amount of work redesigning the site, reviewing every piece of information there, and updating this where needed, but also making sure that we're retaining or making available in a major archive section the critical historical record, not only of our organization, but of the history of this illness and the remarkable efforts that patients and their families have made over the years to support each other. So that is MassME in 2024. We would love to have you join us. The easiest way to do that is to become a member. If you can contribute the full annual membership fee of $40 for individuals, that's great. Every cent goes toward our programming. If not, we want you to know that we never turn anyone away who wants to be a member. We have sliding scale and courtesy memberships. And again, you can just reach out to us at our contact us email or visit our membership page. Or you can volunteer. We would love to have your help and expertise. And if you're feeling like you may not have any specific skills to offer, believe me, if you are a person living with ME or long COVID or a caregiver, or if you just care, you are an expert. And we would love to have you join our team. Together, we are stronger. And I just want to give one last shout out to our amazing administration and communications coordinator, Ellen Rosenfeld, who keeps our entire organization running smoothly. Some of you here today may have had an opportunity to exchange emails with Ellen or be in one of the support groups that she helps facilitate. You'll know firsthand the incredible warmth that she brings to her role. Thank you so much for everything you do, Ellen. Really appreciate it. Okay, that's enough from me. I'm going to turn this over now to my colleague, Phil Chernin, who's going to introduce our guest speaker, Patricia Fennell. Thanks so much for listening, everyone.
Thanks very much, Susan. So I am quite honored to introduce Patricia Fennell, and I'll do so by way of a short story. I've lived with ME/CFS since 1983, and as is the case with most chronic conditions, I've ridden some major waves, dark periods, better periods, even some good periods. But in 2013, after nearly a decade of very mild symptoms, I had a dramatic relapse, which caused a major upheaval in my family life and career and left me despondent. As it happened, I stumbled on a review of Patricia Fennell's chronic illness workbook, the second edition of which had just been published. I bought it, I read it, I reread it, I yelled at it, kissed it, cried over it, smiled at it. I kept it at my bedside for over 4 years, reading and rereading passages nearly every day. It helped me reframe my own understanding of my own illness, as well as my perception of ME/CFS as it relates to other chronic illnesses, and also the meaning of disability. As MassME turns 40, it's sobering to reflect on how much has changed in society's perception of ME/CFS and what we have learned as individuals about living with a disabling chronic illness. And as we considered, we in the board considered who would be best able to speak to these issues, we could think of no one better suited than Patricia Fennell. Patricia is a scientist, clinician, educator, author, and she's also a patient. She's a licensed social worker whose work focuses on chronic illness, post-viral syndromes, trauma forensics, hospice, and restorative justice. She's got quite a body of work. She's the creator of the Fennell 4-phase treatment model, which we'll hear about today, and which I am a user of. Sounds like I'm an addict. I'm a user of the model, which is a powerful paradigm for living with and treating chronic illness. It's been translated into many languages. It's used by clinicians, researchers, faculty, and patients worldwide. And as you'll hear, many MDs take Patricia's course, which is quite encouraging. Her publications are many. They include, as I said, the Chronic Illness Workbook, Managing Chronic Illness Using the 4-Phase Treatment Approach, the Handbook of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, and she's also the author of the Chronic Illness chapter of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Social Work. She's CEO of the Albany Health Management Associates, where she provides clinical services in person and actually more often, as I've recently learned, remotely. And she's graciously given up part of her Saturday afternoon to speak with us today. So thank you so much, Patricia, and welcome.
Glad to be here. So, welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to ask folks to be a little patient with me as you might be experiencing. It is an election weekend, and even here in my office, we're getting door knocking from time to time. So if I have to excuse myself briefly, that will be why, but hopefully not. So let's jump in. So I'm going to introduce to you chronic illness in this phase approach that I use. There's a lot of aspects to it, and before we get actually into the 4 phases, I want to introduce you to some ideas about why we want to talk about chronic illness at this time. There's an increased prevalence of chronic illness worldwide. The numbers go up every year, and it's not one chronic illness per person. I myself, I carried the diagnosis of ME/CFS. but I carry other ones too. And it's not, again, it's not one chronic illness per person. We accumulate them more as we mature. So what's going on? Well, part of it is advances in public health. There have been extraordinary advances in public health. Where I live currently in the state of New York, in Albany, New York, about 100 years ago, give or take, the average lifespan was about 52 years. And then pre-COVID, it had risen to the point of 78 years. And then with COVID, it's dropped a little, but that's an awful lot of length of lifespan in that period of time. And that's because of antibiotics, washing our hands, advanced procedures. So these advances in medical care. So we are an aging population. We are the first generation to live this long. And we accumulate these chronic conditions along the way. Something for us to think about. Now, part of how I've come to think about this and make sense of this for us, for those of us in the ME/CFS community. And before I go any further, let me say this. I'd like everybody who's listening to wear all the hats. Wear the hat as a patient, of course, like I do, but also if you're a clinician, if you are a caregiver, if you're the mother of someone with CFS, if you're the child of someone with CFS, we all wear a variety of hats. And given that we all live this long, the likelihood of different folks having chronic illness is extremely high, extremely high. So part of how I think about this is 4 groups of chronically ill folks. Now, we can think of it as we have our traditional chronic: multiple sclerosis, asthma, lupus, diabetes, Crohn's disease, scleroderma, rheumatoid arthritis. I could go on. And then we have these acute illness or infection-associated patients with lingering symptoms. Patients like me. It could be a cancer patient. It could be a cardiovascular disease patient. It could be an ME/CFS patient. It could be a long COVID patient. It could be a Lyme patient. I could go on with the list. Next, I think about these persistent acute patients. Patients who have stroke, post-pneumonia sepsis, post-injury, people who are post-ICU. And then the natural consequences of aging in an aging population. So part of the effort here is that there are so many chronically ill folks, which we are part of, it begins to be helpful to think from a clinical perspective, a patient perspective, and a research perspective about these different groups. So where does this lead us? To a paradigm shift in medicine. Paradigm shift in medicine. In the 20th century, our focus had to be on acute illness. Now in the 21st century, our focus has to be on chronic illness. A couple of weeks ago, and I was doing some reading, and it brought me to the World Health Organization, and I believe I bumped into a statistic that said that the leading cause of death worldwide was chronic illness. Chronic illness. That's interesting, that we live this long now with these chronic conditions. So we have this real shift in medicine of chronic versus acute care. And where does medicine lie now? How does it need to evolve? We have a necessity for chronic care models. Now, I've developed this one, but frankly, we need more. And we need chronic comprehensive case management together with clinical treatment. Now, speaking to this issue of chronic versus acute illness, chronic illness can be difficult to define, to measure, and medicine has not adapted well to this chronic illness model of care. Patients often fare pretty poorly in acute care settings. I know when I've had to go to the hospital or I've had to go to an urgent care, it's pretty complex given my complex history. So how do I negotiate that? Talking about it with these practitioners, most of whom, in fairness to them, have not necessarily had exposure to somebody with a chronic condition and how that impacts whatever's brought me into the acute care setting that day. With that said, a patient's needs, my needs, your needs vary over the duration and phase of illness we're in. And we'll get to the phases in a few minutes. But the kind of issues I had when I was first diagnosed with ME/CFS, 30, 40, however many years ago, till now, I still have ME/CFS, but my understanding of it, the broader clinical understanding of it, and how I am with it now has changed. Along with that process, we suffer from social stigma, economic losses, and the lack of knowledge and understanding about our conditions. And everybody becomes frustrated with the unpredictability and the chronicity of these symptoms. We're frustrated, we're suffering, our family, our friends, everybody around us, and our providers, our care providers. This is hard on everybody. So here's something else I've thought a lot about. And again, this is how I've written about it. This is how I theoretically think about it. Feel free to, expand on it, develop your own. But I think about traditional disabilities versus chronic conditions. So traditional disabilities, for the sake of argument, might be something like deafness or blindness or whatever might put me or one of us traditionally in a wheelchair. Now, not that those conditions can't be dynamic, but just for the sake of argument. Then we have our chronic conditions, where as people would have said to me over the years and possibly to you, well, you don't look sick, you don't look ill, you're not in a wheelchair, you're not walking with a cane. Well, I have been in a wheelchair and I have had those experiences, but maybe in that moment I didn't look that way. And our chronic conditions can exist on a continuum. Someone can be diagnosed with ME/CFS, and I work with these patients, and they can be mild to moderate, and they're very high functioning. And then periods in my own life or patients I work with now, they're bedbound. So any chronic condition can exist on a continuum, including ME/CFS, long COVID, Lyme, etc. So part of my language for this is static versus dynamic disabilities or illnesses. A static disability, think of it as something as it's more permanent. Not that it can't have ebbs and flows, but it's really more fixed. It's more fixed. Versus a dynamic disability or illness like ME/CFS or Lyme or MS or rheumatoid, or I could go on, which relapses and remits. It relapses and remits. I think of some of the language from my grandmother's era of waxing and waning. Our conditions wax and wane. Now, the legal definitions of what is a disability, what is a chronic condition, what is a disease, this also evolves with time and it changes with time. The social or colloquial definitions also change. What is a disability? What is an illness versus sickness? What is a disease or a condition or a syndrome? Generally speaking, if something is regarded as a disease, it typically gets more attention, be it from research sources or clinical sources, than something that is just carrying the idea of syndrome. And I don't want to fail to mention fibromyalgia, that this is also one of the conditions that any of us and many of us co-currently carry. Didn't want to miss that. Now, within our framework of the phase framework of this theoretical framework, and we have many, many hours of teaching and training that we use, but for the sake of argument today, I'm just going to pick out a couple of these. Now, I've already talked about something that's a false dichotomy, that either you have a fixed disability. If you don't look ill, you're not ill. That's just one example. But today I want to talk a bit about the traumatization that occurs when one has a chronic condition or disease. And this, again, includes ME/CFS, FM, Lyme, cancer. I could go on and on and on. So traumatization. And I think of it as these trauma types. This is part of how we've written about it and published about it. So something to consider, that a disease or a disease syndrome can be traumatic in and of itself. The experience of waking up with these symptoms, dealing with these symptoms on a daily basis, that is traumatic in and of itself. Now, when I first started doing this work, I think I was trying to think about this as I was listening a few minutes ago. I think the first time I presented at one of the very, very early first conferences might have been in 1992. And at that point, a lot of and for many years, a lot of the argument was, well, maybe these patients aren't really ill. Maybe they're not physically ill. Maybe they are trauma patients. And this is somatization. Well, I've been doing this for a very long time. I've seen thousands of people. And I can tell you, the disease or these diseases and syndromes are traumatic in and of themselves. Now, could you have a trauma history? Sure. Could you have a comorbid trauma going on in your life? Sure. Things can be happening. But the disease can be traumatic in and of itself. Important to keep in mind. Now there's iatrogenic traumatization. Iatrogenic traumatization is when you go to a facility for care or you see a provider, and what they provide for you unintentionally can be traumatic in and of itself. So one of the times I had to be hospitalized for burst appendix, different things that happened to me. While I was there in the facility, in the hospital, I caught secondary infections. That's iatrogenic illness, which can result in iatrogenic trauma. Now, another way that that people can experience it is when we see a provider, a therapist, a primary care specialist, doesn't matter, and they typically unintentionally, through their treatment, we can become traumatized just by virtue of what they say, what they don't say. And sometimes we might experience them being dismissive, or we might experience them being any number of things. It can happen in the clinical setting, that we can become traumatized in the clinical setting. Now, it's very important for me to stress this. Trauma is also on a continuum. There can be trauma with a little t, and there can be trauma with a big T. It depends what's happened, to the extent it's happened, and how long it's happened. Those are some of the elements that impacts it. Another issue is cultural traumatization. When I started talking about this back in the 80s, one of the common ways to define someone with what was then called chronic fatigue syndrome, pretty exclusively, it was one of the nasty monikers was the Yuppie Flu, where the assumption was that these were professional class people, primarily women, who were trying to have it all, and as a result of overworking, were getting exactly what they deserved. It's a very ugly term. So how the culture regards us, how the culture sees us, also impacts how we feel. And the media has an awful lot to do with this, plays a very large role, plays a larger role all the time. The people around the identified patient, they can become vicariously traumatized. They too can experience traumatization. I can remember a very young couple, a lovely couple that I treated a long time ago. I've been thinking about them a lot lately, a young Mormon couple. And the husband was very ill, and they had 3 children, I believe, if memory serves. And I remember the struggle that their parents were having with it, and how it had been said to the parents, and then also to the children, that the parents of the young people who were sick, so essentially the grandparents, how could the daughter of the sick person, how could she have selected someone? How could she have done that so poorly? Why did she select a sick person? So there's a variety of ways that bias and cultural attitudes toward illness, toward ME/CFS, toward conditions that are not well understood, that it can traumatize a whole variety of people around the patient, as well as the patient themselves. And then we have that issue again of premorbid or comorbid trauma. Maybe you become ill at a time in your life where a parent just passes away, or you're getting a divorce, or you're fired from a job, or you're in a terrible accident. Comorbidities occur, and it complicates the situation. So those are things for us to think about. So it's important to think about where we receive our care, how we receive our care, and what's the general status, the general state of healthcare where you live. Here in the United States, our medical system is going through big changes depending on where you are, who you are, whether you have insurance, whether you have good insurance, which healthcare system you're in, makes a huge difference in terms of the kind of care you receive. Makes a big difference. And within that healthcare system, there are these different levels of discourse. How do we talk about our patients with each other? How are they regarded in that local community? If you're a long COVID person, depending on where you are in the United States, you might have more sympathy or less sympathy within your general community family healthcare system. So this brings me to the social cultural factors that everybody experiences. These social cultural factors. We have a cultural intolerance of suffering. We have a cultural intolerance of ambiguity. We have a cultural intolerance of chronic versus acute syndromes. We have pre-existing cultural climate toward chronic syndromes. One of the things that we'll talk about more today is ME/CFS. Like all illnesses over time, it evolves. The language evolves, the treatments evolve, the science evolve. So currently, the attitudes toward ME/CFS, in my experience at least, are significantly better than they were 10, 20, 30 years ago, just as an example. And that we have this initial syndrome illegitimacy and subsequent enculturation. So over time, we develop language, we develop approaches that make a really big difference in how we regard the conditions we're talking about. Let me go back for 1 second and say a little bit more about these chronic conditions. We'll talk about them after Jesse, but I just want to say a little bit more about this. This cultural intolerance of suffering. We are very much a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of culture. I can remember some years ago, I was doing some training, some supervising at a large social service agency. And a woman there, one of the senior supervisors, department heads, she had been married for about 25 years, and her spouse passed away very suddenly. And I remember, as was standard in any agency, she got about 2 weeks off and a half day. And I remember thinking, as did the rest of us, how could she possibly recover in 2 weeks? And a half day, was that like for a brunch? I mean, it just didn't make sense. But this is not uncommon in our culture. We are get back to the work, don't feel it, don't deal with it. We also have a cultural intolerance of ambiguity. We like our illnesses, we like our syndromes, our diseases, the way Sister Frances Eustace taught me to write papers with a very distinct beginning, middle, and end. And we expect people to be sick for a period of time and recover. But increasingly, we don't. Or we recover a little bit, and then we relapse, we go back and forth. So these are new times. So I'm going to introduce you now to these 4 phases of chronic illness and disability. And we're going to share this through the lens of Jesse. For the sake of argument, I could make Jesse, let's see, I'll make Jesse maybe she's in her early 30s. Maybe she is a she has a couple of kids, cis female, married, but maybe the marriage isn't going so well. Maybe there are ups and downs, maybe more ups than downs lately. She's working. She's, let's have her working at a bank. She's working at a bank. And a couple of kids, maybe they're young teens. So let's think about Jessie from the perspective of how she's doing, what her healthcare providers might be going through, what the kids, the husband, the people in the workplace. Let's talk about Jessie. So phase 1. In phase 1, Jessie is going through, physically, she is at this sort of coping stage in phase 1. And there can be an onset stage and then an acute emergency stage. Now, physically, behaviorally, this trauma crisis phase for patients, depending on where you live, what your healthcare system is. But in broad terms, it's easily, it could be 6 months, it could be 18 months. It can take a while. And in that period of time, Jessie is feeling a whole variety of, gee, you know, suddenly I'm a whole lot tired, more tired than I used to be. I used to be able to climb 3 flights of stairs. Now I can't. If I climb 4, I'm exhausted. Or, you know, I used to be able to park my car at Wegmans and then I knew where I left it, but now I can't remember where I left it. And that's happening all the time. What's going on? I don't understand. She's noting her fatigue. She's noting that she's having trouble. I remember some years ago, a patient said to me that when she entered this phase, that every small appliance in her home became a Xerox machine. The toaster was a Xerox machine. The coffee maker was a Xerox machine. The microwave was a Xerox machine. Suddenly she was having trouble with word finding and remembering, all these cognitive changes, which just are not making sense. Now, psychologically, what's going on in phase 1? Well, Jessie is having this experience as she's going through this loss of psychological control. She's scared. Suddenly she's not who she used to be, and it's not making sense. Now, she goes to her primary care physician, and she likes her primary care physician, and her primary care physician likes her. They get along, but they don't really know what's going on. And she says, well, maybe you need to exercise more. Maybe, you know, your life is so busy, you know, maybe you need a rest. No, try to find time to rest. Now, Jessie's scratching her head and trying to figure out how is she possibly going to find time to rest. She has 2 kids, she has to work, etc. And maybe she gets prescribed an antidepressant. And in that process, though it's very well-meaning, she feels worse. What often happens for patients in this crisis phase, is Jessie begins to feel a sense of shame. She doesn't want people to see her like this. It can be acute enough that she feels self-hatred. She can start to feel despairing. This is very frightening. It's shocking. She can feel disoriented. She can feel dissociated. I know, speaking for myself, in 1993, on July 3rd, I woke up one morning and I could not read. I could not make sense of what was on the television. I could not make sense of what was going on around the room. That was shocking. That was disorienting. And I'm not the only person who goes through that. Now, what can begin to happen, what can commonly begin to happen, is Jessie begins to feel a little more frightened of others, because she starts to notice, depending on who she shares this with, they're either not believing her, or, you know, maybe they are, some of them aren't, maybe they don't think it's that bad. She gets scared. How do I share this with people? And she can begin to self-isolate, and she can have mood swings, which are completely appropriate under the circumstances. Now, what do the people around Jessie experience? This is the social interactive domain of the phases, the social interactive domain. Others experience shock. Others experience disbelief. Others can feel revolted, can have a sense of, oh my gosh, what's going on? I don't want to be associated with this. Again, it depends on how aggressively the ME/CFS, the COVID, the FM, whatever has impacted her. And others experience vicarious traumatization, like we discussed a few minutes ago. Now, how bad this phase is, how long it lasts, is impacted in part by the general health, maturation of the family, the community, the organizations that Jessie is in, that she is in. Now, hers is a little bit shaky because they're starting a divorce. And her job is pretty solid, but the family stuff is really rocking her world. That's going to impact Jessie's general health, how she's going to recover, etc. And a very common thing happens in the social interactive domain of phase 1 is the suspicion support continuum. This is the place, and I've seen this many, many times, where those around Jessie, friends, family, however you define family, or communities, there are those who say, you know, that Jessie, she always was a bit of a drama queen, wasn't she? Didn't she, like, overdo, or, and others might say, well, what do you expect when you have that much going on? Or others who say, God, this is awful. This isn't, I've never seen her like this before. Very, very common. This is part of what begins to happen. Now, we go on to phase 2. Phase 2. Now remember, Jesse's been dealing with this for about, again, depends where you live, the nature of your healthcare system. Here in the United States, it can be easily up to 18 months if you're in a country that has universal medicine. It can be shorter, then it depends where you are. But generally speaking, you're looking at a period of time here. So what happens in phase 2? In phase 2, stabilization and normalization failure. Stabilization first. Jessie is not better. She's not better. But maybe she's experiencing a plateau. Maybe she's stabilized a bit. Psychologically, she's beginning to recognize what's going on cognitively with her, even if the healthcare professionals are not. Now, maybe they are, but generally, they're not quite getting it yet either. So psychologically, she's carving order out of chaos. Oh, that's right. If I park my car in the Wegmans parking lot, I'm always going to park it in this particular lot, and I'm going to put a bandana on my car. I'll put something on it so that I can recognize it. Or if I do 3 flights of stairs, that's my limit, because I know if I do 4, and I have to come up with some other names, I'm going to put little stickies and labels on my appliances. That'll help me remember what's going on. She begins to come up with ways to cope. Now, also what's going on with her psychologically is what we call increased caution and secondary wounding. Jessie is figuring out really clearly that there are definitely people she can share pretty openly with what she's experienced, and those that she can't. And if she's not careful about it, she's going to have secondary wounding. She's learning that at Thanksgiving, if she sits next to Uncle Zach, he's going to ask her when she's going to stop fooling around and getting back to work. So she's not going to sit next to Uncle Zach anymore. A very common piece of what happens to people psychologically here is that they then socially withdraw from some people, but they go searching for others of like kind. We search for others of like kind. We search for the group. We search for our people. That's what you have here today. Your people, the group, that people of like kind who share your experiences, who share your background, not necessarily totally the same, not at all, but close enough. Now, not all groups are created equal. Some groups are better than others when we search for others of like kind. Work I did some time ago, groups in South Central where people are trying to cope with a whole variety of things in their neighborhood. They may not be, some of them, the best groups. Some of them are better than others, but our groups, depending on the group, provides us with information, support, etc. And it's important to find a group like this one where we're getting good information. Now, part of what also happens psychologically in phase 2 is this service confusion and searching. Back in the day, if Jessie said, well, my specialist, this person doesn't know what I'm dealing with, and gee, he told me it was all in my head, and I know it's not all in my head. Not that some things can't be, but there's something physically going on here. So Jessie now looks for other professionals who can help her. And there can be some confusion on that. Back in the day, people would have called this doctor hopping, the patient's being non-compliant. Well, the patient might be being non-compliant, and they might be hopping, but they might be trying to find someone who has more information or has better communication skills to help them cope with what they're dealing with. But people are searching. They're searching for others of like kind. They're searching for answers. There's also psychologically boundary confusion. But part of what people experience is this boundary confusion. There can be, am I a person with a disease or a disease with a person? How does this actually work? And socially interactively, there can be more conflict. I had one person in a couple say to me, I signed up for better or worse. I did not sign up for MECFS. I did not sign up for this. And in fairness to all of us, again, we are the first generation of humanity to live this long, and nothing about chronic illness was taught in any of my clinical training. So here we are. So part of what happens to patients is in an effort to capture that pre-crisis life, in an effort to be who they used to be, they try to go back to be who they were. And they might be going through a period of stabilization, but they're not necessarily better. And we're not all better. And as a result, patients get on a loop of phase 1 and phase 2, where they crash and they stabilize and they crash and they stabilize, trying to get back to that pre-crisis life. Understandable, a lot of societal pressure to do it, but with a genuine chronic illness, you can't go home again. We can't go back, we can only go forward. Now, with help and assistance, be it from our friends, social workers, rabbis, priests, physicians, physical therapists, occupational therapists, we can move into phase 3. We can move into phase 3. People don't do this alone. They do not do this alone to get off that loop of phase 1 and phase 2. In phase 3, more of a resolution phase, physically, behaviorally, Jessie's been doing this long enough. She's begun to carve, she understands what's happening, more of what's happening with her. She understands if she pushes too hard, she's going to have PEM, a term we didn't have 10, 20 years ago, not like today. Brain fog. She understands, she's beginning to see what she can do and what she can't do. Not that it's perfect, not that it always works, but she's she's learned the rules of the road. And she's found practitioners who she can work with. Things have been changing. So physically, behaviorally, she can be in an emergency stage because she knows that she will relapse and remit. She knows that's part of the journey. And she could have a diminishment of symptoms. That happens too. She could even have an improvement for periods of time. She can have continued plateau, stabilization, and she can have a relapse. But she understands that's all part of being chronically ill. That's all part of the process. Now, psychologically, this is a very important time. When people get to phase 3, we realize we can't go home again. We're not going to be who we used to be, and there's only going forward. And we have a genuine grief reaction now for the loss, for who we lost. I had someone say to me in that bad relapse in '93 as I was recovering, the Patricia that I know is dead. That was pretty hard to hear. And she was right. Not entirely, but there was only going forward. There was only being the phoenix from the ashes to go forward. So I had to learn how to have a genuine grief reaction for myself, and I had to learn how to build compassion, not for the time at the end of the tunnel, not for when I would hopefully get better, but what I was actually going through. And I had to respect my efforts. This is a lot of work. Part of that work is the identification of the pre-crisis self. Who was I? Now, who am I going to be now? And with role and identity, experimentation. Some of us become, we find a new way to go. We find a new way to define ourselves through the creative arts. We need to be able to have a story about ourselves. We need to be able to make sense of ourselves. Why did this happen to me? This is part of this existential dilemma that's part of this phase. How do I deal with this? Why God? Why me? How do I go forward? Role and identity experimentation help people creatively find a way forward. Some people make films. Some people begin to paint. Some people stand with themselves and say, I'm going to ask for accommodations at work, if I can work. But we begin to experiment in different ways. Very important part of this process, when we develop compassion for ourselves, and we begin to experiment a little bit with how do we go forward with these new attitudes and these new norms for ourselves, is this returning locus of control. It's about what we decide, how we're going to define who we are now. And we have a real appreciation for the societal effects, how we're viewed, how the media describes us. For some people, this includes a spiritual development, however they define it. But any way you slice it, part of what happens here psychologically is we wrestle with the big questions. How am I going forward? Do I choose life? Do I choose myself? Socially interactively, part of what happens here is patients break silence. They speak up. Now, maybe Jesse says to Uncle Zach at Thanksgiving, Uncle Zach, I've heard that, I'm not sitting with you anymore. I'm done. They sometimes actually have a confrontation with whomever, setting new boundaries for themselves. And again, there are these really new social relationships, sometimes vocational. Any of the people who are involved with ME Mass, these are not roles that they thought they would have at whatever point in their life, but here we are now, and these are good roles. I have never seen anybody go through this process who hasn't lost someone. I've never seen anybody. Not every pot survives the kiln. However, and then there is the separation. Marriages end, relationships end, families polarized. But I've also seen reintegration, a reintegration of supporters. In the integration phase, in the final and fourth phase, now this isn't a place that we stay long. We get there. But this is part, I'm talking about this, I'll go into it a little bit more in a minute. But part of what's important about understanding this as phases versus stages. Stages imply that it's fixed, and once we go through it, we're done. Go through the crisis phase, you're done. No. Life continues to happen. Our chronic illness ebbs and flows. Life ebbs and flows. So we get to the integration phase. I like to think I've spent some time there, but then life happens. A crisis happens, or I get a new diagnosis. I'm getting older, and it throws me back into the crisis phase. But here's the difference. Now I have a cognitive map. Now I have these phases that give me a way to think about how I move through this over time and what to expect. So subsequent trips through the phases, they're not as hard. It's still hard, but they're not as hard. So what happens when you finally touch the integration phase? Well, maybe I'm in a recovery stage of my chronic experience. Maybe I have a continued plateau. Maybe I have an improvement. Maybe I relapse. I know that it's all in the game, but it's different now. Psychologically, I have role and identity integration. I've cherry-picked the past. Now I'm here. I've developed a way to think about a narrative, a story about how I got here and what I'm going to do going forward, a new personal best, and continued spiritual, however we define it, but certainly emotional development. It continues. Socially interactively, yeah, I have new people in my life. But I also have people that, they got off early, but they're back. Times have changed. They've evolved. I've evolved. Sometimes forgiveness happens. An alternative vocation, if possible. Alternative activities, if possible. So these are the 4 phases. Very quick. Forgive me, but those are the 4 phases. Now, we have these social cultural factors that we talked about before. Remember, we touched on those? So I want you to think about what Jessie has just gone through, what we've described, what her experience is, and the people around her. And these now are the specific social cultural factors that she goes through as well. This is part of what's impacting her experience. So remember that intolerance of suffering we talked about? Here are the dynamics. Here are some of the dynamics. Jessie has now been diagnosed with FM. She's been diagnosed with Lyme. She's been diagnosed with long COVID, ME/CFS. These are conditions that are draped in social clinical controversy. Oh, great. she has to have an illness, and it has to be one with so much controversy around it. It makes it harder. Part of what does she experience? Pressure for non-disclosure. Do you have to talk about it? Is it safe? Should you talk about, be positive. I had a wonderful patient. She was a speechwriter, and very funny, very smart. And she said, "Yeah, I'm positive. I'm positive. I feel like poop." Let's go with that. Yeah, pressure for non-disclosure, and a negative reinforcement for genuine reporting. You know, in our culture, when people ask us how we are, well, do we really want to know how you are, or are we just really saying hi? I acknowledge you, you see me, I see you. And when people ask you how you are and they ask you how you're feeling, how much do you actually say? How much are you supposed to say? So an attitude can be conveyed of characterological inferiority. Oh, sick. Oh, disabled. Yeah. I once had someone say to me, not too many years ago, I was teaching at in a medical facility, and afterwards, one of the clinicians came up to me afterwards and said, "You have this illness? I thought you had it all together." Little judgment there. And again, patients can have iatrogenic healthcare experiences. We can become traumatized in the healthcare system, in part because we are chronically ill and we're interacting with the healthcare system all the time over years. So just by virtue of the amount of exposure we have to the healthcare system, the possibility of that happening, despite people's best intentions, can happen. So what is the effect on Jessie? So part of what happens for Jessie is she's starting to avoid intimacy a little bit. She's a little afraid, and she can engage in passing. There have been times in my life, maybe in yours, when the smart thing for me to do was to pass for well, because it was safer. In general, it's become easier for me to be out about being disabled, chronically ill, but still, I've treated my share of patients who part of how they cope is with addictions and anodynes. And part of what they experience is this social abandonment, this social rejection. This is part of the intolerance of suffering, the social contract violation. I was taught that if I worked really hard and I told the truth, everything would be fine. It isn't necessarily so. This is part of what Jessie and those around her experience. We have a cultural intolerance of ambiguity. Again, we like our diseases, our syndromes, with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Not how we actually experience them. Up and down and back and forth, we go through the phases, and everybody gets to go on the roller coaster with us. So what are some of the dynamics of this? I've had people say to me at different points in time, they're afraid that we're going to catch it from me. So there's fear of contagion, of contamination, and that powerlessness, that can be transferred to us. I've seen care providers who have been fearful about treating ME/CFS, long COVID, FM. I could go on with different Lyme, different diseases, for fear of how they will be regarded by their colleagues. It doesn't help that, again, these are poorly defined conditions. We're getting better. We're getting a whole lot better. But we have unknown etiology frequently and the prognosis. Patricia, are you going to be well enough to do this next week? I don't know. I could have symptoms. One of the things that's conveyed to us is this just world or deserved punishment notion. What did you do to make yourself? Did you overdo it? Did you take the wrong med? Did you see the wrong practitioner? Did you contribute to this to somehow? That's something that's often conveyed to any trauma survivor, not just ME/CFS, long COVID, FM, etc. And the patient, we can feel like a burden. We don't want to burden other people. I don't know about you, but I hate to ask for help. I hate being that vulnerable, but I have to do it. I've had to learn how to do it. What are the effects of this intolerance of ambiguity? Guilt. You just feel guilty for being ill. You feel guilty for having the condition. And grief, depression, not uncommon. You don't have to have these things, but I wouldn't be surprised if you did. We have a cultural intolerance for chronic versus acute syndromes. I'm going to go past this one. The cultural climate. What is the current cultural climate toward ME, CFS, FM, all of our long COVID? Is there a pre-sentiment of suspicion conveyed if you're a long COVID patient? Depends what part of the country you live in. Depends on the attitudes around you. Can negative personality characteristics be assigned to you because you are ongoingly ill, disabled? And are you perceived as damaged? Are you a social example? I remember some years ago when there were still tabloids, I guess there still are some, at the checkout counter, and the comedian Roseanne Barr was holding forth on, I believe it was CFS at the time. And suddenly this person, I think that was her, I could be wrong, but suddenly whoever was holding forth on the condition, they become the spokesperson. So what's the effect on the patient? They can feel shame, diminished self-worth. You can feel like a pariah. Media has a huge role to play here, huge role. Patients can feel scapegoated. We can feel publicly ridiculed. We can also feel supported, depends who's talking, but disabled people can be ridiculed from the podium and they can be supported from the podium. But either way, it's public judgment. You're being judged. Am I a good, compliant, nice, disabled person? And public assignment of role and worth, that happens. What's the effect of that? Loss of privacy, we can be more fearful, but we can have a decreased sense of worth. Now, keeping that in mind, over time, the language improves, the models improve, the metaphors improve, the language improves. Right now, ME/CFS is in much better shape than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and we have every reason to believe that that's going to continue, and we will feel less powerless as a result, less stigma. But here's what I want you to think about, what it looks like from the outside when we are in phase one. So this is not only for the patient's perspective, but how are we seen by our providers, by our caregivers, by our friends, okay? If we are deeply into phase one, when we present, say to our care providers, our clinicians, our physicians, we can have diagnostic and treatment urgency. Fix me now. You have the answers, I don't. Think about Jessie in the crisis phase, what she was going through, what that was like for her, that experience. And as a result, she comes in and says, well, you have to fix me. And her perception is that her treatment and her cure and her locus of control is outside of her. And as a result, she's scared, there's no good answers, and she can have increased self-pathologizing. She can have increased intrusive ideations in a traumatic way. Or she can engage in denial. I'm fine. But her tolerance for the unknown and the unknowable, which is so typical of this condition, of these conditions, it's really low. In phase two, she's beginning to feel like the locus of control is starting to return to her in bits and pieces. Now, part of this is because, as we talked about in phase two, she has sought others of like kind. And she has these alternative sources of treatment now, and support, and identification. And this helps with this locus of control returning to herself. Her tolerance of chronicity continues to be really low. She does not want this. She's not ready for this to be the rest of her life. No. But her self-pathologizing is starting to come down a little bit. And her intrusion, some of the trauma might be easing a bit. This is what comes from searching for others of like kind. Now, with help, as we talked about, if she gets to phase three and she's wrestled with this dark night of the soul and she's experienced this grief and she's begun to carve out a new story, a new way to think about herself going forward, she has this increased awareness of societal effects and very much an increased locus of control. So when she goes to see her care provider, she's also telling, not just listening. She's also evaluating how they perceive her and what they want to do, not just her being evaluated. And she has a slowly increasing tolerance of the unknowable, of the where is this going, and certainly a true expression of self-compassion for herself, for what she's experienced. And she's constructing her own chronic illness experience, her story, how she sees it. And in 4, when she touches, when she has those times of that true integration, this recovery, this stabilization, this integration of self, and this integration of this pre-post crisis self. She's cherry-picked the past. As the woman said to me, and she was a good friend, she meant well, but the Patricia that she knew is dead. She missed her old friend. I had to cherry-pick that past, bring that person with me, and continue to evolve over time. And I had to reconstruct that definition of myself as a person, as a clinician, as a friend, and had to reconstruct cultural role and relationships. Phase 4. So for a visual, there's Jessie right there. Hopefully you can all see that okay. My eyes are not good, but there's Jessie up there in the crisis phase. And there's her provider off to, I guess that's my right. There's her friends and family, her communities, her workplaces. Within those 3 domains, again, she's been in that crisis phase. She can get caught in that loop of phase 1 and phase 2. But with time, she can walk down those steps and spend more time in resolution and with integration. And I think that's, let me just go here. Go through this for a second. We talked about transference, but I think we're about time. I'm going to save that. So if you want to communicate with us, there's some information here, and I think they'll also put it in the links. And here's the book that we've been talking about, but there are others, but anyway, that's there. And I think that's it for me for now. So Phil, here we are.
Okay, well, thank you, Patricia. Would you mind, we're going to take a 5-minute break, but before we do, would you mind just going back to the picture of your book?
There you go.
Yeah,
Yep.
just to give folks an opportunity to take that in and know where to go for more information.
Yes, so you can go to our website, albanyhealthmanagement.com. I understand, depending on what Google's doing with it today, sometimes that'll come right up. Sometimes you have to go by my name, Patricia Fennell, but that'll take you to our website and you can tool around there. And this is one of the books that's there, but this is the one that we've been talking about today. We hope in the future, we've been in some discussion, so you can order it through the website, which will take you to Amazon. We're also hoping to work with, is it Button? Help me. What's the name of the book?
Buttonwood. We'll come back to that later.
We'll come back to that.
Buttonwood
Okay,
books.
so this is a
Buttonwood
place that
yeah.
you can go. Yep.
Yeah, and also just scroll back to that diagram.
Ben, if you could do that for us, can you do that, Ben?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you. It's just a really good visual, and I just want to get.
And you know what?
Allow people some time to dwell on that.
Okay.
So yeah, thank you so much for that talk. There's so much to talk about. I'm sure we've got a lot of questions. I certainly have some. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back to the Q&A. If you haven't already, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A. Okay, so I hope everyone got somewhat rested, rejuvenated. We do have quite a few questions, and I've got a few questions of my own, so I will jump right in with I guess the question that I would start with is, a lot of us have come through your work, certainly I have, through the workbook, but before that you wrote a textbook and a reference manual for medical professionals. When I learned about your work, I was, as I said earlier, I was blown away, and it's been an enormous help to me. I'm interested in what types of practitioners, whether medical, therapeutic specialists, or so on, have expressed interest in your training and seem to be able to absorb and adopt the model to the benefit of patients.
Good question. So the majority of the training, the teaching that we've done has been for either continuing medical education units, you know, so post training for physicians that I've done, occupational therapists, taught a whole course for occupational therapists. They've adopted the book as a textbook, nurses, social work, psychologists to some degree. So the model has been used in those settings, and with those, we've been training medical practitioners as through the different conferences and around the world since, again, since the 90s, and it really, you know, as we approach 2000 and the middle and then the late aughts, I think we call them, many more practitioners. There were plenty of conferences in there too, where I was doing some patient conferences, and of course this was all in real time and in person. For the Centers for Disease Control, I was part of so long ago, but the physician, myself, I think I was with David Bell, and we were doing physician training around the United States. That was one of those programs.
Are there particular specialties that seem to be?
Good question.
Yeah.
That has evolved over time. I mean, when I started doing this in the 90s, it was like no specialties. And now the good news is, well, let me put it this way. The majority of, a lot of the way that we get patients consultations are from other clinicians, usually physicians, and those physicians are usually in rheumatology. They can also be in neurology, and they can be in infectious disease. And so as you all have been doing your work all, you know, these decades, it's really made a difference in terms of the specialties that are interested in. I used to put together conferences where on the for MECFF, I forget the name of the acronym of the organization, but and would have panels that would be all the different specialties. So, you know, the physician who's treating might be there. I did a few of these certainly with Cindy Bateman. Physician might be there, an OT would be there, specialist might be there, I would be there, in an effort to really talk about this. Is it, you know, it takes a village to be chronically ill, and it certainly takes a village to treat us. But it's improved and it's evolved. Now people come with questions as opposed to banging on the door. With that said, there's a tremendous amount of work to do, and there's certainly efforts afoot to continue to have this MECFS, long COVID, et cetera, become part of my approach, become part of medical curriculums. But, you know, part of the way I think about it is, even if all of our clinicians are very well informed, we see them, you know, like I happen to right now, I have a terrific primary care provider. She's great, Dr. Rebecca Elliott, shout out, great woman. She's learned a lot about MECFS from me, and certainly from, you know, some of the patients who I treat who happen to be local. So she's open, she's learned, she's curious, she's great, she's got a great staff. But, you know, the learning continues, it goes on. And so the nurse practitioner is now involved. And so these other specialties that wouldn't necessarily have been brought in are now being brought in. But we need to provide curriculum for those who spend more time with the patient, because I may see her or her wonderful NP once every 3 months. But we need people like me. Part of what I do is to spend time with the patients once every 2 weeks, once a month, because we're working with the patient week in and week out, you know, Caesar's world, trying to cope out here.
Well, along those lines of I guess, access to treatment, how does one go about finding a therapist? I'm talking about someone who's going to help work through these kinds of phase management issues, where we have such a shortage of
Well,
available therapists.
right. Well, you're asking, boy, this is the question, right? Thanks to COVID, the good news is there's more focus on ME/CFS and related conditions like long COVID, et cetera, FM, than there ever has been. And so a lot of work is being done, a lot of efforts being put in. So this is a very good time. There's a good opportunity here. This crisis has provided an opportunity, several opportunities. With that said, we need to train more people who can consider the phases, consider the physiological aspects, consider the psychological and the social aspects, because that's a huge part of this, the intersectionality of it. If we get a referral, like I talk to people on the West Coast, I talk to people throughout the United States, I talk to people in the UK and Australia, and I have my immediate crew, but we're limited. And so part of our effort is to say, okay, get the book or download some stuff from the website, and let's help you figure out how to recruit people, okay, who are open to, if this experience has taught me anything throughout my life, it's humility, okay? So when a patient comes in and says to me, well, you didn't, hopefully this doesn't happen very often, but they come in and say, well, you didn't consider such and such, and you should consider such and such. I've learned to say, okay, talk to me. Send me things. A common thing I say to my patient, send me stuff. You're getting treated this particular way for POTS, send it to me. You're getting treated this particular cancer protocol, send it to me. Now, I'm also very interested in this work. So part of it is finding somebody who says, yeah, I have some good basic skills and I'm willing to go on this journey with you. I had a great mentor, the wonderful Pearl Mendel, 40 years ago when I was struggling with this physical stuff, and she's the best. She was a social worker. She was a Jungian analyst. She was trained and taught, and she said, I'm here with you. We'll figure it out together. That's the person we're looking for. Somebody who's already educated, in part because this is evolving so fast. I have to do a lot of reading every week in public health and it's part of the deal.
Speaking of, I'm gonna move on, Patricia. Speaking of reading, we're getting a lot of hand raising for some of these questions, and one of them is about Dr. Bessel van der Plot's book, The Body Keeps the Score. As you probably know, he makes the case that people with extensive childhood trauma are more likely to develop neurological symptoms and diseases because of this constant flood of cortisol in the body. Is that something you can comment on?
Yep. So I very much appreciate his work. He's a pioneer in the field, and in a variety of settings and contexts, we have applied the phase model straight up to trauma in and of itself, trauma for veterans, trauma for sex abuse survivors. I've spent a lot of my career working in forensics. That's frankly how I started. So I very much appreciate what he has to say. With that said, as the science continues to evolve, I will reiterate what I said earlier in the talk, or I think I did, I'm pretty sure I did. Here's what I've seen in the length of time I've been doing it. The majority of people that I've seen over the years do not have a trauma history. Some do. The majority of people I've seen over the years do not have in the chronic, in which book? In the handbook, I talk about, I look at different, diagnosis, personality disorders, how does your particular psychological makeup either help or hinder you as you begin to have this experience of chronic disease, chronic illness. Trying to tease, listen, this is where testing gets really tricky. when in instrumentation, if you give people instruments looking for depression, let's say, after they've had the experience of illness and disease, it can be misleading. How do we factor in, again, the disease process being traumatic in and of itself? So from my perspective, can you have a trauma history and can it contribute? Sure, of course it can. It can inflammation from any number of things. Allergies, lots of things can contribute to an illness process. But do I think that it is the primary issue? No, I don't. That's my, but talk to me next year as the science evolves, okay? So, that's how I feel right now.
Okay. I hope that answered the question. There was a comment about cortisol. I'm not sure if they're wondering, if you think cortisol plays a role or not. I don't know if you're.
I'll say this: a variety of hormones play, a variety of chemicals in our bodies play a role in how our bodies respond. I mean, one of the ways that I think about our illness process, and I'm just going to use the royal we because it's easier. I'm just going to say our illness process, but talking as a researcher now, more as a scientist, here's what I've observed over the years. Whether I'm talking about ME/CFS, or I'm talking about cancer, or I'm talking about rheumatoid arthritis, or I'm talking about MS, or long COVID, our bodies have only a set number of ways to respond. This is why when we've put groups together of chronically ill patients, that patients in phase 1, in terms of what people are experiencing, be it cancer or this or that, look very similar. Patients in phase 2 look, despite the diagnosis. Now, this is complicated by the fact that diagnoses evolve and get renamed over time. So, I have certainly plenty of patients that I've taken care of over the years that initially didn't have a diagnosis of MS, and now they have a diagnosis of MS. Did they have MS all along, or was that just what their version of ME/CFS looked like? So with that said, the kind of chemicals that are released, how our body responds with inflammation, et cetera, this is really, this crosses diagnostic groupings.
Yeah, I have to say, well, I hope this is helpful for folks listening, that was a big revelation for me in reading the workbook. Just the whole concept of commonality, and we do experience some of that directly, and particularly in our youth support group, where folks have mixed diagnoses, and they find that group very, very supportive.
Well, and again, that whole issue of the first generation to live this long, Phil, you and I are going to have the fun experience as we mature. Now, I'm not going to throw you under the bus, but I'll speak for myself. I just got yet another diagnosis the week before last. I'm up to 12. Okay.
Yeah, we'll let's move on from there. So I'm gonna hit the next question, which is a good one, and I don't know if these people, any of these folks who have upvoted this or wrote this, are actually working with the workbook. But I experienced this when I first got your book. I believe this is well, it's not a he or a she, I can't tell. Anonymous attendee writes, I'm struggling for a long time now to get into phase 3 with more stabilization. I feel like I'm in and out of crisis, in and out of phase 1 and phase 2. With little financial, medical, and family support, how do I get more stable? How do I get to phase 3, basically?
Yeah, that we struggle with this, and it can prolong this experience of stabilization. This is where, again, to the extent that we can, that we turn to those others of like kind. What are the strategies of the people around us? How have they managed to keep it together get themselves fed. This is, part of how I think about this. I can't help it. This is part of my training. Part of how I think about this is God's world and Caesar's world. This is really rough Caesar's world stuff. How do I feed myself? Do I go on food stamps? Can I get food stamps? Can other people advise me about this? What are the I have to, am I sheltered? Am I fed? Who can I share this with? What are these basic resources? This is hierarchy of needs stuff. And I've been there, and it's really rough. And thus the need for others of like kind. And also, this is where having each other and having an understanding of social work and systems, because our physicians cannot help us with this. They're not trained for it. They wouldn't know who to call. They don't know how to hook you up. That's not what they're there for. I don't know if that helps at all, but
I think that this person is saying they don't have what we might consider adequate family or friend support. It sounds like part of your answer, at least, is your support. You need to look to your people, your community.
you need to. So if it's not happening within your family, and this is maybe I didn't stress this enough. I've certainly encountered people that their families are. It's like, geez, can they adopt me? I mean, my God. These people are so supportive and they're wonderful, and they believe him, and I was talking with somebody the other day, and they have an adult son, and they were picking up the son, and they were driving them there, and I'm like, wow, holy moly. So it's can we find a community that can help educate us, can begin to get us services, one of the things.
Patricia, let me move on, because
Go
I know
ahead.
you talk for hours on each of these questions. I want to make sure we
Sure, no, go ahead.
cover
Yeah,
the ones that most
that's
people
fine.
don't
Go right
necessarily
ahead.
know. So this is a tough one, and it's one that we deal with, unfortunately, quite regularly at MassME. And it comes from one of our volunteers who
Okay.
helps folks.
Yep.
How do you advise patients who've given up hope and are seriously contemplating suicide?
Well, I was saying to a dear friend yesterday that I have a conversation. This week I had 3 different conversations about death. One was someone trying to not tell the family or friends, frankly, about trying to pursue assisted suicide. One was, well, I don't need to be specific. Suffice it to say, I have these conversations every week. And I think it's very important for people to the best they can, to find those who can tolerate these conversations, can have these conversations, can understand what, when I was 15 and I was terribly ill, and I tried very hard to get off the planet, but didn't, because there were the right people there. But some of that is just luck. It was luck. And thus the importance of the group. Part of it is learning how to have the conversations. And that's tricky. Now, part of what helped me do this is I found my way to hospice as a young person. Part of why I found my way to hospice was because of what I had already experienced. And part of what I found at hospice is, by definition, you have to be able to talk about death. And part of what I came to believe was, if we could treat the dying this well, why couldn't we treat the living and the chronically ill this well? So part of what I had to do, it wasn't a stretch for me given what I'd already been through, but it was like, people have to be able to talk about this and have to understand what's safe and what's not safe. And so part of it is putting together, like a support group, a work group that helps you do that. I have these conversations every week. I have at least one a week.
That makes me wonder whether reaching out to a hospice center or a hospice provider is is something that would make sense to do if you're interested, thinking seriously about committing suicide, as opposed to the standard call the hotline. And there's a big difference between talking to someone who's actively working to stop you from thinking that way versus, as you're saying, someone or some group who's willing and interested to engage in the discussion.
I think because I understand. If you lived in my town, I know how hospice operates in this town. I know how hospice operates in a few different towns. Depends on the hospice. It depends on the community. It depends where you live. But I think it's be willing to have these conversations. And part of what concerns me is that this is where media hurts and helps. Because as I was saying to one person that I was talking to, and again, 3 conversations, it was a busy week. It's like you said earlier, Patricia, your hair looks like it's white. I'm like, Phil, it's been a rough week. Is saying to that person, part of what happens in media is intentionally or unintentionally, the most extreme or the dramatic tends to be discussed the most. We don't necessarily have the discussion with the person who says, like I just said about myself, I really tried to get off the planet a lot when I was 15, but I decided to stay. And here's why I decided to stay. And I didn't have people saying, well, maybe you should. Now, one of the conversations I had this week was people getting feedback from a group that didn't necessarily have the best intentions about what they were advising. It's tricky. But I think we have to learn how to have these conversations. And we can't do it in a vacuum. We have to do it with each other. And this is why I have my own therapist. I'm a great believer in, if I'm going to listen and really listen to people, then I have to have a place to take it. Yeah. If your therapist doesn't have a therapist and you're talking about this stuff, here's my advice. You don't get into the pool with somebody who doesn't doesn't have their own lifeguard. You don't do it.
Well, on that point, a number of people are interested in what questions they should ask a new provider to determine whether or not they're informed or a good fit.
Boy, wow. Well, here are the standard things that I advise my peeps, and I take my own advice on this. Finding a practitioner, any kind of practitioner, is like dating. It's dating. And you have to understand that you are evaluating them as much as they are evaluating you. And if we have an initial discussion or an initial meeting, did we have a good medical or clinical first date? Okay, good. Do we click? Does it seem, is there, and if that goes well, we'll have another one. And if that goes well, then we have a third. And then maybe I'm going to stay on the ride for a while. But with any practitioner, in my head, they're on probation for a while until I get to know them a little bit. I mean, part of what's really important is, do you feel like this person likes you? Do you feel like this person cares? I mean, again, if you're talking about a physician, these poor people have 9 to 13 minutes, so you got to cut them some slack. But do you have a sense that there's I had one practitioner who one of my wonderful practitioners, the wonderful Helena, she is in a nursing facility now, and we are continuing communication, but she's not someone I will ongoingly talk to because she's got things going on. So as I attempted to recruit someone else, and I talked to colleagues and this and that, talked to a very lovely woman who is a general trauma provider. I figured, okay, that's got to be somebody who's got a little bit closer appreciation, chronic illness, blah, 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 we'll see how it goes. At some point in the discussion, we were maybe 3 or 4 conversations in, she said to me, in honesty, she said, I can't imagine being someone who has something that they never get over. And I said, Yahtzee, time for me to find a new clinician. And I'm sure she's very helpful in a lot of contexts, but you know, what we deal with is kind of, it's like who's in Grant's tomb? We're chronically ill. We're not getting better. So I knew it was time for me to move on.
I'm going to move on. You know, I'm looking through these questions, and I have to say, there are a lot of questions that we're not going to get to, and I would just urge people to buy the book or download the exercises or so on, because even if we got to these questions, they're really not answerable in a few minutes, and we only have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to pick probably 2 or 3 more questions and see if we can get through some helpful answers. There's a question about, which really goes straight to the heart of what I found in your book to be the concept of authenticity, and which you didn't talk about. So I'm glad the question is here. They say, we have inner selves in this illness. Our inner selves can wax and wane as we're stressed and suffer. Our inner selves try to adjust and manage. Sometimes we lose touch.
Yeah.
How can we hold on and experience our inner selves with these illnesses?
It's ongoing work. It's an ongoing struggle. I mean, using myself as an example, I meditate every day, sometimes a couple of times a day, and I've done it for years. Sometimes it doesn't go well. Sometimes it goes well, but that I understand that I'm always working the muscles, developing the muscles, the mental muscles that help me cope, give me nuance, help me differentiate. So that's part of what helps me hang on when it's a hanging on time. And I have come to learn over time, and this is part of helping other people, is I've come to develop, you know, I'm better at doing the emotional heavy lifting. I'm better with sitting with, I have this diagnosis, I don't know what it's going to mean, I'm having these symptoms now, but what can I do right now? What are my immediate Caesar's World coping tools?
Can you talk a little bit about the concept of authenticity as it relates to finding and staying in touch with yourself?
So one of the things that disease does, one of the things that suffering does, is it invites us, though I find that to be that's a little trite right there, but suffering forces us to look at ourselves. And part of making that transition from crisis, fix me now, I want to go back to who I was, and then I stabilize and I'm beginning to accept some of what's going on. But to get into phase 3, it's like, I can't be who I used to be. And some of who I can't be is maybe some that it's okay that I'm letting go of. I can't be as much of a people pleaser. I can't be all things to all people, just as some examples. And it forces us, because we have such limited energy. And when you've been to this precipice of, you know, God, why me? Why should I do this? You know, on the one hand, I suffer fools much less gladly now than I was when I was younger. And on the other hand, I'm much more patient. I mean, this is how, you know, the nuance of the coping, it evolves over time. It's work. This is work. This is hard work. Day in and day out.
We have, I think we have time for 2 more questions. This is a question it hurts me to ask. The question is, are there any actual options for severe patients who cannot take care of themselves? And the reason this is so difficult is because we have many severe patients in the association. We have parents of severe patients. It's almost like a different illness than infection-associated chronic conditions that are sort of in the moderate world. And there are very little options for severe patients. And I guess the question is, have you dealt with severe patients? And if you have, what are some of those options? Do they fit within the world of the 4 phases?
Well, they absolutely do. I was one of those severe patients. When I crashed and burned, there's been a few times in my life, but when I crashed in '93, if it weren't for my dear friend Paula and my dear friend Eric, I'd be gone. I mean, I wouldn't have physically survived. I couldn't wash my own dishes. I couldn't wash my own hair. I couldn't, and so I am, and that's just one time. So I am familiar with this, and yes, it absolutely applies. Now, coping with that and the resources, we are a culture, unfortunately, with very few resources. So this becomes, some of this is very specific to where you live, what your community is, what town you're in, what state you're in, what country you're in, makes a big difference in terms of, are there services for you? And then how do you access them?
Mm-hmm.
Is there support for you? But this is very variable, and it's very real. And we're not going to have less of folks at that. I mean, one of the most recent articles, actually, it's on the website. That this article, if you look at the website, it's in the rotating thing. And of course, do I remember the name of my own article? No, but we're specifically talking about the most severely afflicted patients. And this population of the most severely afflicted patients is growing. And the likelihood of any of us, even I'm not even moderate now. I mean, but the likelihood of me becoming severe again at any point, particularly as I age, is excellent. It's excellent.
Very good. Okay, we're going to do one more question. Boy, there's so many to choose from. Let's see. Here's I think one we can reasonably address in a few minutes. How do the variety of hormone shifts with ME/CFS interact with your ability to manage the disease and deal with emotional fallout?
Ooh. Well, there's a lot of ways I can answer that. This might go with that. It's certainly been my clinical experience that women who are, childbearing age, have menses, etc., menstruating, that their symptoms will definitely be impacted by their cycles. Definitely be impacted by their cycles. So part of, in part of working with patients and helping them develop a framework for management is, in addition to a variety of functional areas, we have a lot of instrumentation on this, but for women is also looking at where they are menstrually. And so I don't know if that answers part of what you were asking, but yeah, we absolutely consider it. And it does make a difference. And then as people go into, I've seen this several times, as people go into menopause and their hormones change, some people have a lessening of symptoms, some people have an exacerbation of symptoms.
Mm. Okay, well, I think we need to wrap up at this point. It's been a great talk. There have been a ton of good questions. I apologize that to those who asked the questions that we didn't get to all of them. However, am going to turn it over to Amanda so we can get to the final wrap up and get everyone out of here at the time we agreed.
Thank you, Phil. And a huge thank you to you, Patricia, for your valuable work. This has been a wonderful talk. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'd like to leave you with a few announcements. We encourage you to check out the links that Ellen Rosenfeld, our wonderful communications and administration coordinator, has been posting in the chat. Following these announcements, the chat will remain open for a few minutes for those of you who wish to connect with each other. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the Chronic Illness Workbook, it's available to order from Albany Health Management Associates or from a local bookstore like our friends at Buttonwood Books. You can find links in the chat. Our next Sunday Conversations event, Your Doctors Are Humans Too, is coming up on November 17th. Registration information is coming soon. If you've been inspired by today's event and would like to support our work through membership in the association, we invite you to scan this QR code or click the link being posted now in the chat. As Susan mentioned earlier, if you're interested in getting involved with our work, there are many ways to do so. We are looking for people who can contribute a few hours a week on administrative work, as well as people interested in working on legislative advocacy in Massachusetts. To inquire about any of these opportunities, visit the volunteer page of our website or drop us a line at contact us, that's one word, contact us, at massmecfs.org. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Please consider a donation to help support our programs and our valuable work. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you again next year. We will keep the chat open and the music going for another 10 minutes for those of you who would like to stick around.